Hey guys, here we are again with our study through the Gospel according to Mark, the man and his mission. And in the section of Scripture that I'm going to ask you to consider this week, Jesus will define what that mission is, and he will define the implications of that mission for us as his disciples. And so our passage for this week is Mark chapter 8, verses 14 to 38. Mark chapter 8, verses 14 to 38. I want to give you a few introductory points, a breakdown of the passage, and then some questions you can use to read this passage, study through this passage on your own, or to meet with someone and to study through this passage with them. And so here's just a few introductory points. Let's remember where we are. We are halfway through the Gospel according to Mark. Mark is 16 chapters. We're at chapter 8. And structurally, this is the pivot point of the Gospel, the turning point of the Gospel. In fact, from Mark chapter 8 to Mark chapter 10, Jesus is journeying to the city of Jerusalem, where he will remain for the rest of the book. And so this is really a turning point and a very important point in the story that Mark is telling about Jesus and who he is and his mission. And so you want to take note of that and maybe even read through this section this week, Mark 8 to Mark 10, to see this journey and to see how Jesus is speaking and to see the ways in which he is directing his disciples as they move towards really the climax of the book in Jerusalem with his death and with his resurrection in chapter 16. And so again, want to remember where we are. We're halfway through. We are headed to Jerusalem directly and distinctly to the city of Jerusalem. We're journeying with Jesus and his disciples on this path with them. And so there's a few introductory points. Now, let me give you a breakdown of this passage of Scripture, Mark chapter 8, starting in verse 14, going down to Mark chapter 8, verse 38. Verses 14 to 38 of chapter 8. So here's a breakdown of the passage. Jesus first questions the disciples and their lack of understanding in verses 14 to 21. Jesus questions his disciples and their lack of understanding in verses 14 to 21. Jesus then immediately illustrates the disciples' spiritual blindness and shows that it will be healed gradually in verses 22 to 26. And what you're going to want to note is the connection between that miracle in verses 14 to 21 and the connection of that miracle to the disciples, to their spiritual condition, and then to our spiritual condition, and how Jesus will remedy that condition in verses 22 to 26. In other words, the miracle and Jesus's connection and conversation with his disciples are connected. Those two stories are connected, verses 14 really down to verse 26. You want to read those two things together. Next, we see Jesus begins to reveal his mission. And this is the largest chunk of the section from verses 27 to 38. We see in verses 27 to 30 Peter's confession that Jesus is the Christ. We see Jesus then predict his death or define his mission in verses 32 to 33. And then Peter responds to this mission with a rebuke, a pretty famous rebuke. This is the get behind me, Satan kind of passage. Peter pulls him aside, sort of speaking on behalf of the disciples, and Peter responds. This is verses 32 to 33. And then we see Jesus' call to discipleship, starting in verse 35, taking us into the end of the chapter, verse 38, or Mark chapter 9, verse 1. And so that's a brief breakdown. Again, the largest section, and really the most important section for our understanding of Jesus, our understanding of what it means to follow Jesus, is really verses 27 to 38 of the passage. So here are a few questions that you can use as you are reading this section of Scripture. So first, what is different about the healing of the blind man in verses 14 to 21? What is different about the healing of the blind man in verses 14 to 21, different from the other miracles Jesus performs? Now, Jesus doesn't perform any one miracle all the same, but what is distinctly different about this one? And the second question would be, what is Jesus trying to illustrate? What's he trying to show with the healing? And again, we want to make sure, as you're reading through that section, make sure you understand the connection between the man and his disciples, between the blind man Jesus heals and the disciples, the men literally following Christ. Again, this is verses 14 down to verse 26. What's the connection? Why are those two stories set back to back in the way that they are? Next, we want to realize how important Jesus' question to his disciples is. This question that he asks, who do people say that I am? Who do people say that I am? Why does Jesus ask this question, and how does Peter answer it? He answers correctly, you are the Christ, but what is the content of his answer? Who is Jesus? What is the content? Study that. Make sure you understand what his answer is and why it matters, because it really is the most important question. Who is Jesus? And then what we find when we get to verses 27 to 38 is the first of 3 predictions from Jesus concerning his death and resurrection. 3 predictions from this point in chapter 8 all the way to the end of chapter 10. Jesus will say something similar to this two other times, 3 times total. And in each case, Jesus will predict his death and resurrection. The disciples, either Mark or the disciples will voice, the writer Mark or the disciples themselves with Mark writing will voice their misunderstanding of what Jesus is saying. And then following, Jesus will talk about discipleship. So that's the pattern: prediction, misunderstanding, discipleship. Notice that pattern. Read through this section. Find these 3, including this one and the other 2, and notice how this is happening and why Jesus would talk in this way. And again, each case, Jesus predicts his death and resurrection. The disciples misunderstand, and Jesus talks about discipleship or the cost of following him. This is the pattern. And again, you want to notice the pattern and keep reading through chapter 10. And so here are a few specific questions with his mission and with the implications. What has Jesus come to do? How does Jesus define his mission? We see this specifically here in verses 32 to 33. What is the mission of Christ as the promised Messiah? As the Christ, what has he come to do? And what does it mean for me and for you to take up our crosses and to lose our lives? This is what Jesus says starting in verse 35 of this passage. This quintessential statement from Jesus about being his disciple. What does he mean? What does it mean to take up your cross? How does that connect? Why is it that in each case that Jesus predicts his death and resurrection, he immediately follows it up with discipleship? What is the connection between what Jesus came to do with what we are called to do as his followers? What does it mean? Better, what does it demand of me? That's the practical Christianity question. What does it mean to take up my cross? What does it mean to lose my life? What does it mean to save my life? And then finally, what is this Jesus demanding of me through this call to discipleship? So again, that's our study for this week, Mark chapter 8, starting in verse 21, going down to the end of the section. And again, we're really just trying to see this man and his mission. Who is this Jesus, and what does it mean to follow him? Thanks, guys.